Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. So I will be talking today about what birds tell us about the health of the Congo Basin forest. So I don't just talk about birds in general, about the forest, but I'll just deep dive into the Congo Basin forest. So I could add a few, I could talk as I present the slides. Most of the slides will be in English, but I could say some few words in French. And for the French-speaking audience, s'il y a des gens qui veulent, vous pouvez m'interrompre, vous pouvez me poser des questions pour savoir si vous ne comprenez pas ce que je suis en train de présenter. Donc, grosso modo, ce que je vais parler, c'est les oiseaux de l'Afrique centrale et du bassin du Congo et l'importance pour la santé de la forêt. It's just what I'll be talking about today. So this is a borrowed slide from in Vermont, Lands Owner's Guide. It gives us the model of what birds are, where they live, and what they tell us about the forest. Because if you look at birds who specialize in different ecological niches, and so if you look at each of those bird species and the areas where they occupy, so we can infer the quality of the habitat that is there, which is just a reflection of that diversity and the health of the ecosystem. So you see, birds will really occupy different niches in our forest, and when we sense or when we look at those birds and when they are there, it's just a reflection of that habitat. And for those who work with BirdLife International, you see the logo is birds are indicators of the state of our biodiversity. So the birds will tell us how important the forest is. And we can use birds to deliver conservation action. This is a very nice strategic habitat conservation model, where we can select focus species and input them into that model if we can identify and formulate what are the limiting factors where they occupy. Then we can combine these models to describe this type of population habitat relationships. It's a very good way to deliver conservation actions by looking at specific species and trying to input every information you know about them so that you can help identify this model. And we all understand how important the biodiversity is for everybody, how it is for the world, and how they deliver some nice ecosystem services. And together, when you work with those birds, you see that they're very, very important in regulating those services which run our biodiversity across the world, from invasion resistance or herbivory to pollination, see dispersal, climate regulation, pest regulations, natural protection, erosion regulations, or water purification. The list is long, it's not an exhaustive list. So we see that birds play that important role. And because biodiversity is very, very important to everyone, even the taking out of one species can be very bad for the ecosystem because it can affect the entire ecosystem. So it is that chain of relationships where each one must occupy that particular ecological niche. And if you take it out, it might affect the entire ecological system. So that's just a brief introduction to really what birds are. What I'm going to deep dive into is the Congo Basin forest, where we do most of our work. And for the ornithologists and biologists in this forum, you understand that the Congo Basin forests are considered as the lungs of Africa because it's the largest carbon sink in the world and really, really critical for the character of the region and the health of ecosystems and livelihoods. The Congo Basin forest will also play a central role when we talk about climate regulation, we talk about carbon sequestration. So it is really, really important that we conserve that forest for the millions of people who depend on it for livelihoods and the services that the forest will always provide. For the birds, there are thousands of species that live in the Congo Basin forest. So we can look from the colorful parrots, we can look at the beautiful hornbills and the turacos, the small passerines and swift. All of them call the Congo Basin forest home. So, and where these birds will exhibit some nice and fascinating behaviors, adapt to different ecological niches, interact with other animals in that complex web of relationships. Therefore, as biologists, we try to explore these birds not only as an exciting endeavor, but it's also very, very important for the conservation of the forest or the region's biodiversity. We can't, when we talk about birds as indicators of our ecosystem, we need to deep dive and look at certain species. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to select a few of the species that we work with. We have our students, our PhD students working on, and so we can see what they've been doing so far and what those results tell us about the health of the Congo Basin forest. So the first species I'm going to talk about today is hornbills. Second is appelons Kalau. These are large birds that need large areas of forest to find fruits, so and sustain themselves. So in that process, because they lead these very large areas, they provide invaluable service to many tree species. So because as they transport the seeds containing the fruits far enough away from the mother tree. So some people always call them, or some biologists will refer to hornbills as farmers of the forest because of that ability to commute these long distances. But again, there is pressure on them. Some of the gruesome images which I had, and I didn't just want to share, where you would see the illegal trade of the casque of these hornbills, because it is used for jewelry, for trinkets, and other decorative items, and really for the African traditional medicine. So there's pressure on these birds where people kill them because of this casque, and that always believe that there is la médecine traditionnelle qu'on peut utiliser avec les casques de ces oiseaux. Donc, j'ai certaines images que je n'ai pas voulu montrer, but we have some pictures of this illegal trade and just the heads and the casque of hornbills, which can. So the first, I'm going to look at the story of our PhD student here in the University of California, Nick Russo. Nick has been looking at the movement ecology of hornbills in Cameroon forest. So he's really doing some very interesting work where Nick, as you can see there with a black casque hornbill is attaching EOPS transmitters to these birds. So we see that and working specifically with the white-eyed and black-casque hornbills. And together, both of these species disperse about 25% of trees in the Cameroon forest. There are two specific questions Nick is looking at. Nick is trying to ask, how does 3D vegetation structure influence the hornbill structures, and how do hornbill movements drive the patterns of seed dispersal? So those are the two questions he's asking. So together we can look at Nick's work and say, what have we seen so far? The methods he's using once it attaches those EOP transmitters is step-size selection functions, which relates to the structural attributes from the hornbill movements, and then it will simulate those movement paths based on the step selection function coefficients, as well as model the spatial patterns of seed dispersal using gut retention times in the seeds of the species. So if there are certain things you want me, you can do one. You can indicate by a raise of hands. So if there is something you don't understand, I can repeat them in French. But most of these things are simple, straightforward. The images across will illustrate really what we've been trying to do. So what is very interesting from the results that we get from Nick's work, it shows that when he compared the habitat at each movement step to that of 10 random points, he found that canopy height, it looks at vertical complexity, distance to small and distance to large gaps are important predictors to the movement of these hornbills. From that illustration, you see that the y-axis is the value of the selection coefficient, where those positive values indicate a positive selection. So if 95% of those 95% confidence interval does not overlap with 0, the predictor had a significant effect on the selection of the hornbill. So what Nick has found so far, and from these different illustrations, when you look at the canopy height, you look at vertical complexity, then distance to small and light gaps, it shows that all those hornbills are selected for taller canopies. When you look at the difference between the white-thighed and black-thighed hornbills, it shows that the white-thighed hornbills are more likely than black-thighed hornbills to select for greater vegetation complexity in the vertical column. But both individuals are strongly varied in their tolerance for small and large gaps. So for the seed dispersal simulations that he did, it took into account both movement and behavior of the hornbills and habitat selections. So it is very clear that the dispersal distributions take each of these hornbills and predicts the probability of the seed dispersal. So what you can see from the simulations which Nick did, so we see some of these very cool maps of the hornbills and show how most of them will move these long distances, mostly to the northeast and the southwest. Most of these hornbills was captured in the jar where you put this ear transmitters, so you could really follow these birds. And what is very interesting is the longest distance, or the greatest straight line distance from the jar is about 110 kilometers from the jar. So you can see the range of the species go way beyond the boundaries of the jar. So when we describe or we delimit protected areas, we need to also look at the processes that is responsible for creating the patterns that we see in general. So it is not just protecting the jar, that if we want to protect the habitat of the hornbills, but we also need to protect areas way beyond the jar. For the black-cast hornbills goes right down to Gabon and Congo. And then the black-cast and the white-cast hornbills, you can really see how these movements from the species, how they move from the edge of the jar and back. So the birds really occupy this huge forest, and that is why we call them the farmers of the forest. So the second species which I'm going to talk today will be the Chiracus, or we call it the Musophagides. Musophagides comes from the word musa, which is plantains or bananas. So in the literature, they are referred to as plantain eaters, although they don't really usually eat plantains. So Chiracus are beautiful birds too, which are arboreal and spend most of their time hopping through the trees of the forest looking for food, which is mostly fruits, seeds, leaves, and flowers. So in that process, they also play that role in dispersal. So they have some very hard, nice oral adaptations. So we know how the calls of the Chiracus are in the forest, which include short and broad bills, fleshy triangular tongues, the ability to move the upper beak relative to skull, something that we call cranial kinesis. It's a nice oral adaptations which the Chiracus have that reflects how they call in the forest. The big ones, the great blue Chiracus, are classified as species of least concern by IUCN. But then they disperse seeds to around 39 different tree species. Although we don't really clearly understand what their movement patterns are across the region. But for the Bannerman Chiracus, you see there's an illustration I'm holding in my hand. The Bannerman Chiracus is listed as endangered because of its very small range, which is severely fragmented and suffers continuous decline owing to the pressure from human use on the mountain habitats in the forest where they live, mostly in the northwest regions and west regions of Cameroon. So we have another PhD student called Antoine. Antoine Tekam is looking at the movement behavior of great Chiracus and the seed dispersal based again in the Jab Reserve in the southeast part of the country of Cameroon. And what Antoine, you can see Antoine holding a red Chiracus is doing similar methods like Nick, placing all these ear transmitters on Chiracus he captures using canopy netting methods. And so for every, so it downloads this the data as the birds are moving from one part to the other, so you can understand changes in climatic and ecological factors. Look in relative to the dispersal patterns of this species. Donc, Antoine est notre étudiant, un doctorant de l'Université Yaounde 1 qui travaille sur les Turako. Donc, il met, il capture ces oiseaux, il met les émetteurs IOPS pour essayer de voir, étudier le mouvement de ces oiseaux dans la forêt tropicale. So you can see some of those images clearly. I put some of them in French, dispositif de capture, émetteur IOPS, base station récepteur radio, which Antoine is using to capture these birds. So just like Nick, he looks at the influence of vegetation structure on the blue turacos, how they move across, how they select for habitats based on where they are, and with data he's downloading from the ear transmitters, as well as canopy height. So you can understand, you can really see where these big birds live, following the data is downloading from his ear transmitters across the region. What is very interesting, and some of the few conclusions which he's having so far, it shows that turacos like hornbills, they have that ability to disperse seeds very far from the parent tree. So you can also consider them as farmers of the forest because of this long distance dispersal movements across the region. So again, we have not done enough. You see, so far he studied with this small number of, or he has been successful in putting ear transmitters to four or five of these oracles as just to study them, but need to do more studies over longer periods of times in order to better master these dynamics of the grid oracles across that region. And so looking at them for a longer periods of times and determining whether the potential changes in home range size are due to fluctuations in food availabilities. So are we going to, are the trees, are the birds moving in relationship to the fruiting trees or seasonal variation? So those are questions that we need to keep asking ourselves. But it's the study in progress, and Antoine is still there in Cameroon in the field carrying out this work. So as we get more information, we're going to share them with you. And then the other species we're going to deep dive into will be the parrots, or what we call the African gray parrots. So we have another PhD student, Benedicta from the University of Bamenda. She's looking at the movement patterns, habitat use, and community engagement in the conservation of African gray parrots. And the last stronghold of these parrots in the Lobeke National Park in the southeast of Cameroon. So parrots, as a simple introduction, we have them here in California in pet stores. And last night in the news, I was just watching somebody who went into a pet store and stole a parrot. These birds are sold here for $7,500 a piece. And so the police is looking for someone who was selling a bird, the green parrot that was stolen from a pet store. So in Africa, where these birds really come from, they inhabit dense lowland forests, although we can see them up to 2,200 meters in altitude in the eastern part of the range, and commonly also found around the forest edges. You can see them in clearings and gallery forests, in mangroves and wooded savannas, and at times in some cultivated areas. If you live in Yaounde, mostly around 5 a.m., you can see the birds flying across the city, going from their nesting to the feeding sites. And in the evening, you hear them all flying. They're quite loud, so you can see them flying back to the nesting sites. They're renowned for intelligence and mimicry skills. So, but they face severe threats from habitat destruction, hunting, and pet trade. And the last stronghold in Cameroon is really the Lobeke National Park, and where we still have challenges to understanding the movement patterns, how to use the habitats and the community development in conservation. So that is really where Benedicta is looking at her work. What she's looking at this time, this is still work in progress. She's trying to determine those movement patterns and home range characteristics of each of the species and evaluate the perceptions of what people really understand about these birds, what are their attitudes, what are the traditional ecological knowledge of human communities that can really help us to understand the conservation of gray parrots in the habitats where they live. And so What Benedicta is doing, she's going to use this Argos pinpoint 150 trackers to harness the method to monitor the movements of these birds and provide critical insights into areas within the park where gray parrots are most vulnerable to human pressure. As she's studying. Again, this is work in progress. She's doing that once we get more information, again, we're going to share that with you. But these are three different species which I just picked at random. But again, based on what our students are working on to tell us, oh, really, if you study these birds, you can really see why we call them farmers of the forest. So the birds really tell us when we look at each of these bird species, we are together occupy that forest, we can infer the quality of the habitat that is there, which is just a reflection of the diversity and the health of the ecosystem. So conversely, it's not just studying the birds. If we identify and manage our forest ecosystems towards the diversity of conditions that the birds need in order to thrive, we can also improve the forest ecosystems through our stewardship. So as biologists, as ornithologists in this forum, we know that birds offer that tangible and compelling reason for many people to engage in forest stewardship. It is something that we need to protect. It is something that we need to do. It's something that we need to understand. If we need to preserve the lungs of the earth, we need to see what the birds are telling us, where they are. Once the population starts declining or something starts happening to them, it means it is something that we are doing to our forest, which is what we are planning or something to avoid. So if you look at the short abstract which I presented, one last slide I wanted to add was nomenclature. Yeah, in the US, birds will no longer be named after people. I don't know if we are also thinking in that same light. Again, it's a slide I'm just putting out there. I didn't say we should be thinking about that. If you look at this beautiful, I put two beautiful birds on the slide here. The first is the Scots oriole, which is native to Southwest Mexico, was named after a US Civil War General William Scott. William Scott oversaw the forced relocation of indigenous peoples in 1838 that eventually became the Trail of Tears. So that bird is going to be, the name is going to be removed. So we don't want to name them to people who bring memories of sadness to the world. But also on the right side of our slide, you see another beautiful bird. We call that the Narina trogon. If you've done birding in the Congo Basin, Narina trogon is one of the most beautiful birds you can see with your scope. Narina is named, this bird is named after Levaillan's mistress. Levaillan was one of these birds who named a lot of birds in Africa. So when he found this bird, he loved women a lot. So the bird was so beautiful, so it is believed that Narina was his girlfriend. So he named this bird after the beautiful girlfriend from the Khoi origin in the region. So is that what we're thinking? I don't know. So I just threw these slides out there that since people are thinking of naming species, what is the history of naming birds and what do the names that we have to most of these species tell us? Do they indicate the importance of those birds in their natural ecosystems, or they tell us the history of those who first put the names on these type species when they were captured for the first time in science? So that is what I'm presenting for today, and I thank you very much for your kind attention. I could answer a few questions in French, but I am sure that the slides were very illustrative of really what we're trying to talk about. So I will stop here and take a few questions. Thank you very much.